This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk.
Grab your microphone.
This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk. WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
Guest today, Daniel McCullum.
But we need to tell them, they have to know that this is August the 13th, 2017.
Yes, and that's Dave on the board. So, let's say something about two memorials that are here just recently. I meet all sorts of people there. It's an occasion when you see people that you haven't seen for years. And so Janet Anderson passed, and her memorial service was sometime later, and Pat Chappell also. So Dan will probably have something to say about Jan. She was part of the Methodist Church of Talwood, and also on the county board for quite some time.
Well, she's one of the diminishing numbers of former HIPS
Yes,
ladies.
household interested in pollution solution.
Now, they had to change it to households after I joined.
Yes, it was housewives. So
Anyway, she was one of a grand bunch of ladies that are sorely missed. They went out and joined the job market.
yes, so you would break up glass and all sorts of things.
Well, they weren't, I think, responsible for the first glass drive, but they were pretty much in charge of almost everyone that happened thereafter. But they did all sorts of things, and the creative ability of these ladies and the astonishing ability with which they implemented them was overwhelmingly to their credit. They had a great newsletter.
Yes.
And shortly after their founding, I discovered the newsletter, and so I joined HIPS. I wanted to get the newsletter. But these ladies weren't content just to have somebody write on the running board. They wanted somebody to push. So they found work for me to do.
Yes, and I can remember running around getting axles so that you could break the glass without danger, and it went to Streeter, I think.
Streeter, yeah.
Yes, and that was the foundation of the recycling center. I think it had a lot to do with eventually we're getting a recycling center.
Well, the first actual location was the former City Public Works garage, which I managed to persuade this city council to
Former City
allow them
Public
to use it.
is about 20 miles to the west of here.
Well, it worked real well, except that volunteer efforts are difficult.
Yes, it's a small town.
So ultimately, it probably was a bridge too far.
Yes, well, it has had very interesting people there. One gentleman provided in his will for the high school, so the high school was a donation, more or less.
Well, I think while we're remembering people, we need to remember Steve Apotheker.
Yes.
I mean, he was single-handedly the most seriously responsible person for recycling in Champaign-Urbana while he was here.
And Jack Paxton was here this week, and Jack Paxton part-time lives in California, and he knows Diana Meisenhauser, who was married to Steve as a result of the recycling center. And yes, all these things come together. He unfortunately died from Lou Gehrig's disease.
Yeah, it was a sad, sad thing.
And but he had a lot to do with starting. And there was a guy who, Lindsay, Greg Lindsay was there before Steve, and he went on to get a PhD from Purdue, and he put cameras on the bicycle trail that goes through Indianapolis, where it was expensive to do cameras. And he was trying to figure out whether the adjacent low-income community could use the trail, and it was fairly obvious that it couldn't, because people that were coming through were usually dressed appropriately. They had bicycles that were worth money, and the neighboring community was using bicycles as a wheelie sort of situation, not a corridor. And so he's now a professor in Minnesota.
Well, I'm glad you reminded me of Mr. Lindsay, because my associations go back at the very beginning of recycling in this town anyway, so it's a fond memory.
Yes. So, and then we had Pat Chappell, who was a spirited lady, and I suspect she probably was with hips too. And she knew all the Audubon bird calls. She was quite a character, and we'll miss her a lot.
Well, it was a missed opportunity for the News Gazette not to include a life remembered of Pat Chappell.
Yes. Yeah, sometimes we have to be there to remind people that they were, and they contribute, and we're losing those people at a rapid rate. Well, Daniel has been helpful in many ways. He's been mayor for 11 years before he retired, and but before that he has done a lot of things that are helpful for trails. We bought 33-mile of trail in the Monticello area, and there we had an opening. The Railroad Museum brought a car up to Whiteheath, and we had a formal opening, and the trail at that time was open because the tracks had just been taken out, so wherever the semi-trailers had been moving, there was a reasonable track. So, Daniel, tell us a little bit about your experience of traveling between Whiteheath and Clinton.
Well, there was some opposition voiced to the use of that trail line for biking.
Yes.
And there was an organized ride, which of course I was delighted to participate in, as well as a number of other intrepid bikers. We all assembled at Whiteheath, and after appropriate comments by various dignitaries who were there, off we set. And we didn't get very far. An obstructionist, or a group of obstructionists, had put down a bunch of roofing nails.
The roofing nails have a flat bottom.
Had a flat bottom, which of course made the spikes stand up. And in short order, there were about 6 or 7 flats, 3 of which were on my bike. Unbelievably, we were able to continue on because there was a Japanese guy who was one of the best bikers I've ever seen, who could fix 6 or 7 flats in about 15 minutes. We were back on the road almost without any significant delay. We got to the first road crossing, and there were a group of folks who were set up there with chairs and, again, more obstructionists. My recollection is I kicked over one of the chairs and we kept right on going. It was a great ride to Clinton and then a great ride home.
Yes, you probably 6 hours. It was a long time. You had to.
Well, it's a good long ride, and remember,
23 miles from Whiteheath,
and it wasn't as developed as the trail that we're going to be having.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Opening very soon.
It was rough and tough, and you had to dodge a few spikes that were left there.
Yeah, and I think the most intrepid bikers on that ride didn't ferry their bikes out from Champaign-Urbana.
Yes.
We rode out, rode the distance, and rode home.
Yes, and that was good exercise.
I was a little more fit in those days.
So, well, Daniel's been involved in a lot of things. His mother has been involved in school affairs, and we know about that from a different situation. And he has territory over in Danville, so he knows the Kickapoo Trail well. And he's written a trail guide for it. And he's also intrigued as to how we get across the rivers. There's one at the Salt Fork at St. Joe, and there's...
there's a bridge. There's a low bridge at St. Joe, but it's the bridge across the Middle Fork.
That's the big one.
That's the biggie.
100-odd feet off the ground. And it's a quarter of a mile long, and it has 998 ties on it. They're big bridge ties. I have put wooden plugs in all the holes so that the holes wouldn't receive water and rot. So that took me a while, and you don't get them all in, so you have to saw the top off. And we started to drop in ties between the ties so that people wouldn't freak out because it was high. But that didn't stop. When we'd get someone else that was used to riding a motorcycle across that bridge at 50 miles an hour, when you get them off and explain what we're doing and they have to walk across, very shortly they're down on their backside. They're not used to that sort of height. And the height comes fairly quickly. Once again, you had several highways. You had the 150, and then you had the interurban, and then you had the main line.
Well, I'm hoping that there will be some significant historical signage along the trail. And the other thing that I think is unfortunate is that the trail offered the possibility of an extended trail offers a ride between Urbana and Danville.
Well, that'll come. It's a rail banking act. Our 33 miles in Monticello were prior to rail banking, but the railroaders were getting afraid that in 1980s there was deregulation of planes and trains and a whole bunch of things, and it got to be very easy to abandon small networking railroads because they hadn't been kept up for a long time, and derailments were possible. And if you had a derailment, then you could have an excuse for closing the line. And
well, right-of-ways are extremely difficult to create and almost impossible these days.
They realize that.
And abandoning one so needlessly, as was done on repeated occasions in Vermilion County, which has some really interesting scenery.
Yes, it's
part of it's rather close to my farm on the river.
Yes, and you had a bridge there that went down towards Ridge Farm, I think.
You had two lines. You had the Great Creek line, which ran out of Danville.
Oh yes, that went all around the bottomlands.
And it crossed the Vermilion, rode along the side of the river for a period of time, went through the village of Great Creek.
Yes.
And turned up, I think wound up in Westville. A really sad loss. That would have been a beautiful, beautiful trail.
There are all sorts of...
But then the Milwaukee was abandoned, which had, and if you think the crossing on the Middle Fork is high, I guarantee you that
it was huge.
That the trestle across the Vermilion there, because there was a steam line, a major steam line, you had to keep the tracks very highly elevated to get across the river.
Yes.
And it was scrapped out about 10 years ago.
Yes.
That's just probably a quarter of a mile below my farm in Vermilion County.
We're in the process of re-railing between Whiteheath and Seymour, and so we've been over there looking at old railroad areas that would go to the General Motors factory and looking to see how we can salvage railroad. The rails of various weight. If you're on a main line, there's sometimes 135 pounds per yard. The interurban could run on 65 pounds. It was a light tram, but you didn't put too many 100-ton grain cars on that. So there's various rails in between. The ones we're putting down in Whiteheath are in the vicinity of 95 pound, I think. The Railroad Museum runs a little heavier than that, and they have a steam engine, and like you say, steam engines are really heavy. And it was interesting that where you were on the end of that trail near Weldon Springs, the trail actually went down a river creek pattern. You didn't have to excavate so much soil if you went. So there's various culverts, and then you go across this truss bridge. and if you were running a steam engine and a heavy load, you had to get momentum on that side to get up to the other side. And so there's lots of stories about the language that happened at the top of the hill when they just didn't make it, and then they had to break the train in two and pull it into lane, and then go back and get the other one. So it almost took half a day to get together again. So
It sounds like the same thing on the locks on the Ohio River and the Illinois River, where you had 600-foot locks, and of course a 15 barge.
Yes, you had to take them apart.
Would have to be broken in half and towed through at separate occasions. Now the Ohio has 1,000-foot locks as well. So.
Yes, and you have to know the politics behind some of these things. The railroads they get so early on to create a railroad. They got land, so there was some subsidization there. But the highways in the Eisenhower area, you got interstate highways, and you got airports, and they were fairly heavily subsidized. So you have to know the balance between the canals and the airlines and the roads and the rails.
It was all politics.
Yeah, absolutely, and still is. So
yeah, right. Same news.
The reason why this trail is in action is because we knew about the Rail Banking Act. The railroaders were cognizant that bicycle people were buying the trails, and they had some problems. One was that the federal government mandated the removal of the bridges, because if you fell off that bridge in Vermilion County and fell 100 feet, you were dead. So there was a liability problem. So when you abandoned the railroad, the trail people got a chance to buy it and save the bridges. So we were glad to have implemented an interim trail use agreement between Conrail and the Surface Transportation Board and the railroaders. And the railroaders were, like Dan says, you're never going to get these corridors again. And there was some suggestion that you wouldn't be able to get military across the country easily. So there was a congressional concern that the beds were being removed, and the answer was to create a interim trail use agreement. There's enough public money in these railroads that was sort of justified as a public use, and you got enhancement money to help you develop the trail. The locals had to buy, and so the locals have had to buy this 25 miles to Danville. The bridges are saved, and the titles are acquired. So if you come to a farm that has a reversionary title, you don't have to go 7 miles around to get to the other side. That title is publicly reserved for future use of the railbed. And we do have easements where people provided the railroad with interim use for the railroad, so they have the right to get it back. It's a reversionary clause. So the reversionary clauses have been quieted, and that's what's happening in the St. Joe area. The first phase was from Urbana to St. Joe. The second phase is for the big bridge in Danville over the Vermilion. And Daniel was wondering what will happen to the bridge at St. Joe. Well, we started out with a very good steel bridge. It's a fairly recent bridge with steel pylons, not wooden pylons. If you have a steel pylon, it can, or a steel bridge, and it gets fired, it buckles, so you have to replace the whole bridge. If you have a wooden bridge, you can replace pieces of it. So this is one we cared about a lot. We dropped ties between ties so people wouldn't freak out, and that was a lot of work to do, and we plugged the spike holes. And now the $12 million that's going to this 25 miles and the $3 million that's going to, from the Railroad Act, that's going to the piece between Urbana and St. Joe, that is enabling engineers to prefabricate a bridge that they then put on top of the bridge. And it's they remove a few ties, and so that the prefabricated bridge will sit upon the steel bridge. I'm not sure they weld it there, but it may be that they've studded it there so that it won't move, and it's a very convenient crossing of the Salt Fork. And it's interesting that it's at the node. So the whole area to the north, the river has been channelized down there, and the area to the north, the Soil and Water Conservation and others have gotten together, and have planted that to native trees. And the old highway from the St. Joe side goes around, and we're hoping that that might make an access to those bottomlands. And yeah, you might have some comment or question there.
Well, there was a very large meander that was cut off from the Salt Fork,
Yes.
Leaving the meander on the east side of the river.
Yes, I think that the when they open on the 25th, it'll be 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That opening, the parking lot will be on that bottomland.
Well, the interesting thing was that after probably decades of trying to raise a crop on there and watching it
Yes, they failed.
flooded out, they finally figured out maybe that should be a wetland.
Yes, and that's very good.
Every once in a while, you wake up and figure out doing the right thing.
Well,
Don't count on it, but
okay. Let's look at what you've been writing a trail guide to this corridor. So where do you start? You start with the Quakers unit on Main Street, or Weaver Park. Where do you start?
well, I start at the Griggs house, which is not there anymore, but that trail doesn't reach that far. It should.
Where was the Griggs house?
The Griggs house is on Griggs Street.
Oh, right in this side of Urbana.
It's on the east side of Urbana. Well, what was then on the
It's
east
where
side
they've
of
just
Urbana.
put in a concrete thing on North Broadway. It's fairly near to there. That's where Griggs Street
Well,
is. Near the Station
the,
Theatre.
Yeah, it's not far from the station. It's east of the. It's west of the Station Theatre, where the Griggs house was, and it was named after the person who was more responsible than any other local person for the creation of the railroad in the first place, Clark Robinson Griggs,
Okay.
who also the community owes a debt to because he got the university here.
Uh-huh. So
So-
you got to speak into the
Yeah.
phone.
So I certainly hope that there is some effort to recognize Clark Robinson Griggs when the bike trail is actually extended into the, and it actually could go to Champaign.
In front of Carl and behind Pravina.
Well,
How do you going to get it over there?
the city owns some of the right of way on the Champaign side anyway, so it ought to be connected all the way through Champaign.
Yes, so that you can get to probably through Bonneville to Kirby Avenue, so you don't have to ride on 10 where you can get killed, and go out to Kirby and into Whiteheath, and then by the Railroad Museum and into Monticello.
Well, I think that's speculating too far in advance, but they can at least get it to Griggs Street. And if they get it to Griggs Street, I think given the fact that some of the right-of-way in Champaign is already owned, some of the old Big Four trackage, that it would be nice to have the trail link up to Champaign as well.
So what would you do? You would have a kiosk that would have a photograph of the Griggs house, and you would have a little history of Mr. Griggs.
I would like signage the length of the trail.
Aha.
So that's my first motivation was, since I guess I could say I've been fairly familiar with the route since I've traveled on it for most of my 80 years. My father liked to fish at Kickapoo, and I've been up and down 150. And,
Then you have a farm out there.
well, no, that's more recent.
Yes.
That's much more recent. But the fact is that one of the things you need to add is some level of local history or historical significance, because what you've got is a bike trail along a highway. It needs a little bit of additional amenities, and signage is important. Well, let the locals learn a little bit about where they're living.
So I think that's up to, once this contract is finished, then the Forest Preserve is in charge of Champaign County Forest Preserve in Champaign County. Vermilion County Conservation District owns the pieces in Vermilion County. So it'll be up to them to have it. They already have a tax base, and they can apply for grants.
If they want to help ensure the success of the trail, make it interesting. Put up the signs. This is no big deal.
The Railroad Museum is good at that. They even they hold up the train every once in a while and do interesting things that keep people from being bored. And if we bring historic trains into Champaign, that's 25 miles. So the average 4-year-old is going to get bored by the time he gets here. So we have to look at an old elevator or a prairie or something on the way. So that's exactly what you're saying.
Interestingly enough, if the line were continued all the way into Danville, which would be, I think, a delightful achievement.
Well, let me tell you that the interurban is now a road. So if you go into, see, this corridor finishes level with Kickapoo State Park and then drops into, that's why the name is Kickapoo. But the old interurban is still there. The railroad is still used for storage. So you can get into Danville almost on an old interurban where the road is on the interurban bed.
Hey, Dave, you're both getting really excited here. You're interrupting him. I'm going to go back and hear the rest of that story about taking this thing into Danville. Sorry to interrupt, but...
Well, one of the things that, one of the stories that I remember the interurban. It ran until 52. But when and I never got to ride it. My mother, who liked to do adventuresome things, would give me a nickel to ride the bus line all the way around town, but I never got a trip on the interurban, for which I feel deprived. But I saw those interurban cars repeatedly as we took 150 to Kickapoo and to Danville. And one of the stories that comes out of the part that goes up or down into Ellsworth Park and back up into the city is that the grade was steep enough that the lights dimmed in the cars as they...
Yes.
In other words, all the juice was taken to get the car up the hill.
So yes, in the long run, I hope we get into Danville. And most of these communities, whether it's Danville, Decatur, Bloomington, have excellent local bicycle ways. And the talent is to get connectivity between those places. And,
Definitely.
So yes, so we envisage some kiosks along there that would tell us. But there's also a Lincoln Trail, which is sometimes about a mile south or sometimes 5 miles south and parallel. So it provides some interest. Tell us a little bit about the Lincoln Trail.
Well, the pioneer roads were from here to there.
Yes.
They bore no resemblance to the Jeffersonian grid that
we talk about
that we deal with today, at least in the flat country. So if you were proceeding out of Washington Street in Urbana going eastbound, you find that there is an angled road that takes you to the Salt Fork, and of course a rather historic site because it was the location of a tavern at which Lincoln is almost certain to have stayed in. I even discovered a article in the St. Joe Record, which a daughter, this was back in the 20s, remembered being a very young girl with Lincoln in residence as he rode the trail. It crosses the highway there south of St. Joe and continues on again on an angle. Any major country road that runs at an angle in this area is almost certainly a remnant of a earlier rationalization of the road scheme. Most of the angle roads, the here to there roads, were abandoned because they cut across, made it difficult. You bought a piece of land, and you found that you bought a quarter section. You find there's a diagonal across it. The farmers didn't want that, so the landowners were the ones that were probably initially more responsible for creating the grid that we have today. They wanted their whole quarter acre, or at least they're willing to part with the edges of the along the section line, but they sure didn't want it run diagonally across the field. And that's one reason why it's very difficult to create right-of-ways today, because what you're doing is cutting across and dividing up farm fields. And that was a big problem when they created the Woodland Junction cutoff at Glover, which slices diagonally across the eastern part of Champaign County.
That's a big question. It's just about a mile east of St. Joe. And if you work with Southern, I'm trying to think of the railroad that comes through there.
Well, it's the...
yeah, I'm blanking out. But anyway, they would like to. They have 2 tracks there at the moment, and they. That's
only a siding track.
Yes,
it's single tracked, but they have to have a passing track.
And they would like to reserve it for 3, and so some of those trains are pretty long.
Well, interestingly enough, the Illinois Central was double tracked all the way from Chicago to Cairo.
Yes,
I was the only mayor between Chicago and Cairo that protested the removal of the track. What happened was when the Gulf Railroad bought the Illinois Central, they helped to pay the cost by selling the track.
Yes,
and then they had the gall to try to persuade people that you could run as many or more trains on one track than 2.
Yes, and they'd be safer, and they changed the signal system, which was more updated when it was with 2 than with 1 track. And some of that money went into multinationals and not into the upgrade of railroads. So difficult. So Union Pacific is the railroad that comes through at Glover. And what the Forest Preserve has found is that the Big 4 was prior to the Union Pacific. So they actually have the right to go across the grade, and so I think they're going to go across the grade. Then there are 15 lawyers out there of Union Pacific that don't want that. If you're going to go over, you're going to have I-beams that are pretty substantial to get there.
Well, interestingly enough, when the East-West Railroad was first built from between Danville and Urbana and Champaign, it was the Indianapolis, Bloomington, and Western, and IB&W, which some people probably as disgusted customers called the I Better Walk. But interestingly enough, then when the the Frisco actually was the C&EI, which was a subsidiary of the Frisco Railroad, built the diagonal, the Woodland Junction cutoff. The tracks, of course, crossed at grade. And in reading this story, reading the old newspapers trying to get us the story of building the 2 lines, the first through train on the Woodland Junction cutoff center punched the big 4 train on the tracks at Glover.
Okay.
I'm sorry, are you saying it ran directly into it?
Mm-hmm.
You said it's center punched. Can you explain to the rest of us what center punching, what you meant by that?
It ran into it.
So it's like it was like a T-bone or something into the trains.
Right.
Okay.
And that's why you had, ultimately you had the 2 rail lines, an interurban line, and a road. And that was a little complicated. That's why the major overpass that was built there to try to rationalize that.
And if you were a bicyclist, you could go on the new bridge. Well, the old bridge, a train apparently ran into one of the pylons, and it dropped the road by about 4 feet. And
that dropped all the way to the ground. I was there the morning after that happened.
Uh-huh. And so traffic that came along and didn't know that there was
a car or 2 dropped in the hole.
So a few people are walking around with walking sticks after that. So they put in a new bridge, but it was before the era when highways decided to put in bicycle ways. So how would you go over the track if you got the chance to do it? Modern concrete bridges have a highway for bicycles. I don't know whether you can drill into the modern bridge and create a side track, but so there's a lot of discussion about it.
Well, certainly there are going to be a lot of problems when you're putting in after the fact in effect a second right of way.
Yes.
And we've faced the same problem in the bike trails that the Champaign Park District have put in around Kaufman Lake.
Yes.
You have the interstate and a lot of, and in one case you go under the waterway.
Yes. So we were starting at the Griggs. So take us a little further. Do a linear.
Well, I didn't bring my notes, but I think the first significant place you come to is the Mount Olive Cemetery, which is one of the most attractive cemeteries, if you like cemeteries.
It's on a hill.
It's on a came.
Yes.
Which is a geological feature where a river ran across the surface of a glacier and then dropped into a crevasse, and piling up material.
Created a mound of gravel.
It's like Blue Mound in near Monticello, just on the Champaign County Monticello line.
Yes.
Then there's a Folds Elevator, which comes up next.
If you can stand in Monticello in Mount Olive Cemetery, and you see a big grave for the Folds family.
But anyway, moving on, you wind up with, let's see, Folds.
You have a Pioneer Grain. The road goes off at an angle and goes across the node of the meander. So,
well, the original the railway line actually went through the center of St. Joe, and that's what the bike trail will follow. And I might also add that the road system, 150, follows the tracks rather than the tracks following the road. The railroad was there first.
Yes.
And it was a more circuitous way to take the so-called Lincoln Trail or the Old State Road, which dropped to the south. And one of the early questions was when they were going to build a hard road between Urbana and Danville, just how they might do that. And one of the considerations would have been to follow the original Lincoln Trail, but that didn't make any sense, obviously. It's easier to put a right-of-way next to an established right-of-way because then you don't have the land, the objections of landowners. I mean, they don't like it, but the fact is it's not cutting through the middle of their property.
Well, we're interested in some of this territory because it has prairie on it, and some of it has been exterminated on the east side of St. Joe. There's an area between there and the Glover Bridge that has been mown and perhaps even herbicided, but we would like to know that people to know that that's got original soil.
Well, when I was in high school, we took a field trip to the Big Four line east of Urbana because that was a remnant prairie.
The university used to rent the thing for grad students and for their own research. And most of that's gone now because the width of the current trail is huge.
One of Dave's major concerns about the new trail. This would be a good point to point out. People are listening to the WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. This is the Prairie Monk Show, our weekly look at the environment and rails, trails, and other things having to do with conservation. And today they've been talking about the Kickapoo Trail, which is due to officially open. You can go to near where Aldi's is. Is there a better landmark that's closer to it at the beginning?
I'm not quite sure where they'll be meeting, but I think they're going to meet in St. Joe rather than on the Urbana.
Oh, well, I'm going to start in Urbana. I'm not going to trek all the way over to St. Joe to get started. I hope they don't mind. In theory, it's starting at 5:30, and so I guess I'm going to meet them
Friday
about
afternoon.
Halfway, yeah.
You have football games that are in competition and a bunch of things that so you have to watch. But It'll be between 5 and 8 or something like that.
Right. And so, Dave, you've been talking about Remnant Prairie. One of the things that Dave is so fond of about keeping rails and turning them into trails is the fact that they are so old, they actually have some of the best prairie that we still have in the area. One of his complaints about the Kickapoo Trail is it is so blastedly wide. It's 10 feet wide. He says, why couldn't they have gotten away with 6 feet, or couldn't we have agreed on 8? So do you have an opinion? I kind of understand 10 feet, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I didn't have anything to do with the design of the trail. And,
It's a one-size-fits-all, and it's by Engineering AASHTO. It's an association of transport.
Can you see a good
engineers?
value in it being 10 feet wide? Yes, it needs to be.
3 years ago, I rode the Tunnel Hill Trail down in, from Harrisburg down to I think Thebes, Illinois, and then I went on to the Ohio River to spend the night and come back the next day. The idea, I think you got it right. The one size fits all is probably a standard that may be a little too much.
So yes, so the next segment that joins on to the St. Joe Trail, we hope will be a little narrower.
Well, it adds to the cost of the trail, and obviously, if you're trying to build a trail and it's an expensive business, the more load you put on the wagon is going to break the wagon.
Right.
So
Okay.
yeah. So now you've talked about the Glover. Can you say something about Muncie? Did you ever go to the Homer picnic ground?
Or where?
The Homer picnic ground. If you go straight to Ogden and you go south, you encounter an old Homer, and it had a covered bridge, it had flat races, it had some brick houses, but it also had
It didn't have many brick houses.
no, there's one left.
After the railroad came through, obviously, which was the Wabash, it was 1.5 miles to the
South.
railroad, and one of the enterprising folks in Old Homer arranged to have everything that was worth saving towed across the frozen prairie to get to the Wabash Railroad.
But the fairgrounds is still there. The covered bridge is gone, and there's a new Homer Lake, which is further west.
Well, the abutment to the old covered bridge remain. The cemetery, the old Homer Cemetery, in which the founder is buried, and the mill, the man who had the mill there in the first place, Moses Thomas, they're all planted up there on the hill.
So, would you ever think of recreating this little old Homer?
It was an enterprise solely to develop traffic on the interurban. The people who first, when the interurban was first thought about, when McKinley was developing his plans to join Urbana and Danville, which were the first links of his empire, later Electric Road Empire, it was going to go to the south and hit Fairmount, Homer, Sydney, perhaps Philo, I'm not sure exactly where it was there, but obviously that was putting a lot more mileage of track in an area where there was dubious potential revenue from transportation. So it ran strictly east-west along the railroad because of the right-of-way that was already there. It was a cost consideration, but he wanted to develop enough traffic to justify a line down to Homer, which was then a much larger town than it is today in comparison to the other towns locally. I think it was after Champaign and Urbana. I think at the time it was the third largest village or municipality in the county. So it was McKinley who put the entertainment enterprise there. Of course, it was only a 3-month operation because the Salt Fork flooded that entire bottom, and so it took a major problem every spring to clean out the mud and shovel it out to make it work. And it lasted until the late 20s. There are a lot of people with fond memories. I interviewed a lady one time who told me, who lived to be past 100, by the way, and this was in her very latest years. She said that her parents would not allow her to go to the Park. They played cards there.
Oh, they did much more than that. There are stories. You run into them. Yes, there's a history there. Most of the people who know about it have gone, but it's, yes, it's interesting.
Well, one of the other things, they had a bear chained out there, which was a rather, speaking of cruelty to animals, I think one patron got a little too friendly and got chomped on, but I think the bear was left, gone after that.
As you move across on the river, you canoe as well as ride bicycles.
Yeah, I wrote a river guide too.
So you get to Conky Town. And when you get to Conky Town, you're starting to get a geological fault where there's coal and there's it's a different cat, and you get a rolling hills, and so. Can you say something about Conky Town? Because when you walk across the river at St. Joe, you're likely to be in the mud. When you walk across the river at Conky Town, you're on limestone, I think. It's a gravel bottom.
Certainly the bedrock is closer to the surface as you get into Vermilion County. As far as I know, and certainly when I wrote with Jim Smith, the guide to the Big Vermilion and its tributaries, you don't reach any bedrock until you cross the line into Vermilion County. Conky Town had a mill site.
Yes.
And there's a very interesting cut in addition to the abutments of the covered bridge. I do remember the covered bridge, incidentally. It survived until some kids managed to
set fire to it.
Set it on fire in 1956. The covered bridge, the only covered bridge that was ever built in Champaign County was in Homer, and it unfortunately died of neglect. The highway had already gone through, but the old bridge remained. They wanted to sell it at one time for scrap, to somebody to harvest the timbers in it, and the population rebelled, saved the bridge, but they didn't reinforce the bridge. And in one evening, quietly, the bridge settled into the river. School was abandoned the next day, and everybody trooped out from Homer to lament the passing of the bridge. There probably wasn't a dry eye at Homer when that happened. But Muncie, I might get back, was the creation of the railroad in the sense that it was to the north of Conky Town because the river dips well to the south. And overnight, Conky Town became Muncie. People moved up to the tracks.
Ah, okay. So, yes, that's probably no more than about 2 miles. So, then at Muncie, you used to have gob piles. They were in deep mining with people coming from Kentucky and Tennessee.
Well, they were slope mines. They weren't shaft mines. They were all slope mines. Just there were dog holes all over Vermilion County.
Uh-huh.
Fortunately, where my farm was, there weren't any. But everywhere else, Ellsworth Park was just the whole area along the North Fork to distance north of Danville, all through where Ellsworth Park was dog holes and coal mines.
And I think some of them one of them still visitable in Kickapoo State Park. I think there's a slope mine there.
Well, they were all over the place. I can remember visiting some that weren't even closed.
Well, Vermilion County went to strip mining. Mission Field is all strip mining, and
well, the river excavated the top soil.
Yes.
So it was you mined along the river,
and
they moved the roads and the river just to meet the needs of the miners.
And
that was before reclamation was required. So they made pretty well a mess. Fortunately, somebody thought that it might make a good state park. And by the way, the locals bought the land, not the state.
Yes. Well, these are the sorts of places that Daniel would like to have you visit, and he can tell you about it. And there should be some historic guide. It might be these days. You might have a cell phone with information on it. You might have geographic information services, but pieces of interest should be announced on the Kickapoo Trail, so that you can take a dive off to the side and see where there was a cottonwood tree where Lincoln used to. The judge and the lawyers that were supporting people would travel on horseback, and that tree was there when I came. It's gone now.
Oh, you mean on the Old State Road?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's good south. That's a good deal south of the proposed bike trail. I don't think, or should I say, the soon-to-be bike trail.
But it's still information that people could go to.
Well, it'd be nice to have a sign there or signage. Frankly, people who come here are disturbed by the fact that there isn't any scenery. Well, first of all, there is scenery if you care about it.
Yes.
And if you go to the east, Vermilion County has great scenic areas. But the problem is that people expect they come from the ocean, the seashore, or the mountains, and they come here and they think there's nothing to see. Well, there's plenty to see. Just use your imagination.
6 inches elevation can mean a difference in the prairie that's out of sight.
Well, interestingly enough, the Grand Prairie starts in the east central portion of Vermilion County. So the Grand Prairie, which of course were the grasslands that extended all the way to the Mississippi River, is a transitional area. For instance, the tulip poplar tree, its eastern limits are about where my farm is.
So, yes.
It's natural.
So
It can grow elsewhere, incidentally, but it naturally occurred only as far as the eastern part of Vermilion County.
So the second phase of this will be the big bridge over the Vermilion. And I assume it will be something the same. You'll put a bridge on top of a bridge. But the ties, the bridge ties are really huge. And it's a strong bridge. And if a railroad has the right to come back in, and it does have, then that bridge should probably be used. It might be that a change in technology, you'd have a different sort of railroad, so you might have to build something different. But we're keeping the structures together for possible future use.
Well, interestingly enough, in the river bottom is the concrete foundations for the
interurban.
Of course, the piers aren't, or the posts aren't there, but the concrete's there.
Yes.
I put a din or two in my canoe getting through there. So.
Yes, and right south of there are the furrows for the strip mining. If you care to be in a parking lot that's just right there, you can use your imagination. You can see the furrows where the river has been moved across and moved across and moved. So they've changed the setting of the river.
Well, before the road was abandoned, the old road was abandoned. On where the Salt Kettle Monument was originally on the east side of the river, which actually is not terribly close to immediately close to where the salt settlement was. You could go down that hill, which was a brick road, and then it stopped. And partly it was a casualty of the fact that they'd been strip mining and moved. Finally,
the road had been taken out. Yes, that kettle is now located on Route 74 at a parking lot. And
a long way from where it was.
Yes. So you're concerned about getting into Danville, but there's a little community there. The Possum Trot is there. There's restaurants there.
Or Hillary?
Yes, Hillary is there.
Might help their economy a bit if that bike trail went through there.
Yes, but
it's already got spawned a restaurant in St. Joe.
Yes,
right there at the tracks and the.
Right, and he's got bicycles on the wall and whatnot. So people are starting to realize that this trail will have economic benefits. It'll have sociological benefits. People will communicate with each other in small communities.
People could lose a few pounds biking it.
Yes,
And there are a lot of people who could use it.
And the paraplegic people get to use it too, and that takes them off the road. So they're rather interested in this. The Paralympic people.
All I can say, Dave, is keep up the good work.
So, well, we have to vacate here, but remember that 25th of August, not too far away, you'll be invited to be out there on the Kickapoo Trail. It'll be the first 7 miles. At the banner end, it's near to Aldi's and Walmart. At the St. Joe end, it will be near the restaurant in downtown St. Joe. We're not quite sure where it will be, but I know that they've got a parking lot on the bottomlands, and they're extending it. And so I assume there'll be some parking on the flatlands that are part of the meander. And we'd just like you to be there. Partly we have an evil intent that the Heartland Pathways trails that Daniel has ridden have huge potential. But it was before there was a Rail Banking Act, so we don't have that $12 million. But we do have a nice rail trail over the Sangamon River, and we hope that this trail, if used well, will help to, and the Monticello one is already being used well.
Well, remember this, David, an aircraft carrier seems to be a lot sexier than a bike trail. And as long as we're willing to devote billions of money to building machines of destruction, those have the priorities these days, unfortunately.
Yes, but there are people out there who will do things like the Katy Trail. We lost a 200-mile trail across the top of Missouri, but the Katy Trail, one person decided that this wasn't going to happen again. He bought the whole trail. And so this is, we have to thank
Where's Elon Musk when we need him?
Seriously.
So we thank Donald for coming, and we'll have him more because he's loaded with stuff you don't really know. But he'll help put together some of this information. So this is Dave Monk at Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.